as Europe enters the mid-19th century, there's much that is changing in the world in that time. The Industrial Revolution is radically changing where people live, how they work, what is their employment, the nature of city versus country, the nature, the sense of the city now is a place where things are growing and happening, but at the same time it's full of dirt and noise and poverty. This is an ambiguity that's going on in the culture. One part of that also is the sense of nationalism rising, that countries are identifying themselves more and more by their nationality than they are by any common factor between cultures. To some extent, I am French, I am German for the first time. Not so much I am European or I'm part of the Christian culture that pervaded Europe before that. There is a sense of everything being in flux and flow. Within every generation, or every 2 or 3 years, there are massive changes. One thinks that the steam engine was first introduced in about 1820. By 1835-40, trains exist already, paddle boats exist. By 1850 and 60s, these are already switching over to coal-fired ships in the ocean and factories in the cities. And by the end of the century, we are into the we are past the steam engine into the internal combustion engine and oil-driven vehicles rather than coal-driven vehicles or wood-driven vehicles. And life in the city now being organized around factories rather than around craft. All these things are changing. All these moves are changing, creating a sense of flux and a sense that what you are experiencing is not a complete overview of what's happening, but rather you're part of a process for the intellectual. You're part of a process, you're part of moving along. How does this affect the arts? Well, the idea, the surety of resolution of an agreed upon goal of that your work of art must be in itself complete is less and less important. Composition, whether it be in art or in architecture or music, can be incomplete. It can be incomplete, and yet it still exists in this beautiful piece of art. This is the idea of fragment, that we view life in fragments. We feel life in fragments, and then what we perceive in a given moment is not the entirety of something, but rather a fragment of it, a part of that. And so art also can become a series of fragments, a series of not entirely resolved compositions, which fall into this larger narrative of which they are just a part. They are just a focus on this. What does this mean in terms then of music? Well, the idea of ambiguity enters into more and more into the ethos of composition. That a piece in and of itself may be ambiguous, or a structure within that, a harmony within it may be ambiguous, or that whole sections of a piece are related only in a larger sense to each other. There is an ambiguity in the sense there isn't necessarily a totally defined, clear arc to something. We have the sense of flux and flow and of a myriad of possibilities of where things are going to eventually end up, where they are going to resolve. In terms then of harmony and structures and counterpoint, this tonal ambiguity has 3 forms that we want to look at today. And first is the idea of harmonic sequence, that in a given composition there may be more than one harmony or just one harmony that's associated with a tonalization of another key. Instead, there may be whole sections which are sequences in different harmonies that are simply then repeated in the composition at another tonal level, in another key, and the piece is strung along now and then more over these larger arcs of key relationships where we have larger sections of music which are complete harmonically in their own way, but in them of themselves they are not long enough to say we have modulated. Instead, we have had a sequence of this material and then it's more or less repeated somewhere else. So on the local level we have that issue. That harmony over the long term may be a series of tonicizations, never any complete modulation, but it's tonicizations eventually leading to a larger whole. Secondly, then we have the idea of tonal ambiguity in terms of modal ambiguity. What mode are we actually in a given composition? Before, if we had ambiguity in a piece, and that often happened in a piece, it was eventually resolved at the end. Now it isn't necessarily completely resolved. It is left up in the air to some extent. Lastly, then, we have structures that in and of themselves are ambiguous, that they have their own identity, but their resolution is not obvious, nor is the obvious and logical resolution the one necessarily we're going to go to. We're going to go to a way that leads to less to absolute clarity than it does to a sense of suspension, more ambiguity. So let's look first at harmonic sequence. Harmonic sequence then is this sense that we have blurred the border between tonicization and modulation. Then we have extended functional harmonic sections which are tonicized, and then they are simply sequenced in other keys and repeated as more or less verbatim that way in a new key. Then these sequences add up, and eventually you have a tonal arc through the sequences rather than the individual section modulating into a series of keys. You have a series of independent sections played, and their arc together creates a larger tonal sequence. Here's an example from Chopin. You probably recognize this. Of course, you probably know that already. Now, it is in itself a complete composition. It just starts in C minor, ends in C minor. But in the process, we have made a journey which seems to be the repetition of a very small melodic fragment, and just various minor variations of that throughout. Every two measures, we seem to be doing that same thing over and over again as we switch our tonal center. Now, if you look at that and try to do a correct harmonic analysis, we completely lose the tonic somewhere in the second four measures. And when we come back to it in the measure 5, it is still ambiguous. We're only touching at it as we move through more and more secondary dominants, secondary leading tones, and common tone chords. And we touch back on it, but we're always moving away from it again. Always moving in that same rhythm, that same sequence. And it becomes very difficult for us to listen and hear in that a tonal center. Listen to the first phrase just alone. All makes sense in one key. However, Chopin is constantly reinterpreting where we are hearing our tonic. The first phrase is in C minor. Now he goes down and A flat becomes our center, so our submediant, and it repeats essentially the same progression. Here again, now we go back to C, and we get a progression in our dominant, a secondary dominant, to our semi-dominant. We come back to our tonic, but you can feel it doesn't feel like we really have come back to C minor as our tonic anymore. Instead, it sounds like we're still in transition, and we get right after that a D major harmony. Now we could interpret that all in one key. However, every four harmonies are functioning to each other in the relationships that we expect: 1 4 5 1, 1 4 5 1, and so forth. And we have 4 separate tonal regions, all making a circle: tonic, submediant, tonic, but tonic ambiguous, more like tonic, we're moving somewhere, to the dominant. And this is how Chopin has arranged this piece, in the sense that every measure, we have a sequence, a harmonic sequence, and it is arranged in such a way to create a larger arc, but it doesn't in itself resolve to either one key or another. Instead, it is an ambiguous. It's not a tonicization, it's too long for that. But on the other hand, we are not we're not modulating either, because it's not clear enough. We're not resolving to that new key. We don't have a confirming phrase. So it stands somewhere in the middle of that. This is this ambiguity. Have we changed key? Have we not changed key? In this case, it is left purposely open. In that sense, harmonic sequencing is a purposeful ambiguity of where we are within the harmony. Now, another type of ambiguity is what actual mode the entire composition is in. Part of this has this idea of fragment, that a piece doesn't necessarily have to be complete from beginning to end, but can exist as a fragment of larger music. This idea in the Romantic of invisible music, that this piece is simply, what we're listening to is simply a fragment of something much larger, and that the key in it actually is in, the mode that it's actually in, can itself be ambiguous. Even conservative, or no, I shouldn't say conservative, that's a bad word, but the traditionalist composers, not the avant-garde, not the people who are pushing always forward, but people like Brahms, who is very comfortable in the forms and styles of the early Romantic, even in the classical period, has this sense, often his pieces, we don't know which key we're in. Now, you saw this earlier, say, in Bach, that often Bach will start a piece that's in major, in the relative minor, but he will resolve very clearly and unambiguously by the end to that relative major. Brahms doesn't feel necessarily that he has to do that. He can leave it, to some extent, ambiguous. This is from Opus 76, number 7, the Intermezzi. I'm just going to play the opening phrase and talk a little bit about that first, and we can hear this and see if you, when you're listening to my playing this, see if you can feel that it really doesn't settle in any particular key. It points, but it never settles there. And so forth. I think you heard right at the beginning, it sounds like we're pretty solidly in A. Then it seems to come to a conclusion after a dominant. We start in A here, and this is Bach. You can see this coming out of, say, with Bach as well. So we get the relative minor of C major, and then we get a dominant in first inversion with the 7th, passing down to a tonic. And we have a tonic C major, but immediately he throws in, holding only the medium pitch, that is E, only the third pitch, which is E of the tonic, or mediant if we're in C, and immediately seems to confirm that. But then he repeats it. Gives us our C. Let me try that again. I'm sorry, I just missed that. There's our C, and he walks right by it. Instead, this is the dominant of A and resolves to A minor. Have we really modulated? Is this piece really in A minor? We had so much of it in C until that point we changed, went right by the C major chord, which was supposed to be our tonic, went right back to the A and resolved it at the end in A. Have we remodulated to C major? Have we modulated to A minor? Did we start in A minor, briefly tonicize C major, come back? Hard to say, isn't it? It is ambiguous, and the entire composition runs this way. You are always being driven one way or the other, whether you're towards the minor or the major, minor or major. And at the end, Brahms simply repeats that opening phrase, almost to insist on the lack of clarity, which key we are in. It remains ambiguous which key we are actually in. Lastly, then, we have to think about one of the more interesting aspects of development of harmonic structures, and that is the idea of the ambiguous harmonic structure. A structure in itself, a harmony, which is intriguing in and of its own right, but doesn't necessarily have a clear resolution. Now we think about this. This is the idea of our idea of counterpoint is dissonance must resolve to consonance. We've had that from the beginning to the end. Now, as we've been talking about how in the early 19th century to the mid 19th century, more and more dissonance is being loaded into the composition through contrapuntal means, sevenths being part of that. Now non-structural are passing sevenths now are a regular part of the piece. A seventh chord simply exists now as part of the color, the dissonance moving towards a tonic. And also then our extended and altered dominants has loaded more and more dissonance onto the dominant as we go forward. Also then we have our embellishment harmonies, our common tone harmonies, the common tone fully diminished and the common tone augmented sixth chord, adding more and more dissonance that always resolves in some way, eventually will resolve. And then on top of that, the essentially we heard say in the structural linear harmonies that don't resolve at all, they simply continue to be contrapuntally moving until they eventually resolve in a strong tonic somewhere. This is already part of the repertoire by mid-century. What happens now is that occasionally, especially in really important forward-looking pieces, there comes a harmonic structure which is in itself ambiguous and does not obviously resolve, or resolves in multiple ways, that it has an ambiguity of where it must go. It may move in many directions. These ambiguous harmonies then are harmonies which have ambiguous resolutions, in which the resolution is in many ways the rhetoric of the piece. How is this going to resolve? Where is this going to go? And they're often treated very differently within a given composition. They may resolve one way in one section and another and another. And that resolution is less likely going to be according to the rules of harmonic progression than it is by the rules of contrapuntal motion. That is what direction the counterpoint is passing to. And even then, that resolution may not be to a consonance, it may not be to the resolved harmony, but it might be yet another ambiguous harmony. We often refer to these then as the chord, the mystery chord. It has its own identity, we know it, and how it's behaving is a matter of discussion and interest as we're listening to it. The most famous of this is the so-called Tristan chord from Tristan and Isolde by Richard Wagner. This chord comes in at the beginning of the piece and is worked out through the entire composition without what can be said is a clear resolution of exactly how it behaves, even to the very end. And to this day, composers and theorists will argue endlessly on the real resolution, the real identity of this mystery chord. It's not important for us to worry about that issue. What's important, though, is that it is in and of itself. The ambiguity is interesting. The mystery is interesting. The incompleteness is interesting. Let me play a little bit from the Vorspiel, that is the beginning part of Tristan und Isolde, with that famous chord. And so forth. Here we have 4 times we are presented this harmony. That particular harmony and a resolution. A resolution which is ambiguous. Where is it going? What key are we in? It starts out where it looks like we're in A minor. So possibly that's our dominant. But then he simply repeats it. In this case, it resolves to a G major minor 7. Are we in the key of C? Perhaps. This time, it resolves to a B major minor 7. Are we in the key of E minor? E major. And then he repeats that to make it more confusing. He plays a bit. So we think we're possibly hearing this now in the key of B, key of B. E major minor 7. We're going to get our A major harmony, minor harmony. He goes to an F major harmony. Again, ambiguous. Purposely avoiding the obvious authentic cadence there for a deceptive cadence, and he never comes to an A in that section. Moving on, he gives us a D major minor 7. Where we to C, and here we've moved to now to C major. Here we have another D major minor 7. So we see we're constantly moving. The key is not clear, and the resolution of that famous chord has not told us the key, has it? It's not told us the key at all. Now, how is this functioning? There are many ways that theorists talk about this. One way we can see this, that's an apoggiature in A minor. We have a French augmented 6, and it resolves to the dominant 7th. That's the common way to interpret this. Another possibility is this is a non-functional half-diminished 7th. So it's F half-diminished, non-functional, linear harmony leading to a dominant. That's perfectly fine. You could argue that. Another possibility, this is really actually an add 6 chord. And it is in this case, an F major harmony, F minor harmony, excuse me, F minor harmony. And with an added 6th in that. Possibly. But all those answers are ambiguous. They don't really give us a clear resolution. How use tonic to a French augmented 6? Very strange. But regardless of how theorists come up with that, if we look at the orchestration of that, it's pretty straightforward of how Wagner's thinking. He's thinking contrapuntally. He's got then this rising line, which resolves down there contrapuntally. So one line's there, and that's in the middle. Above that, then, when he comes down to that D sharp, also G sharp comes in, and it's a chromatic line raising. Here comes in B, and that's how probably Wagner's thinking about it at that time. Based on the middle line and the bottom line. He's thinking probably entirely contrapuntally. This is how the line moves. And so regardless of what we come up with as an explanation for it, we understand where he's doing, what's going on harmonically. That is, he's leading these lines that end, simply come to an end. They leave space. They are a fragment in and of itself. The gesture is incomplete. It is a fragment, and it is ambiguous where it is leading. This is increasingly then the strategies of the late 19th century as we move towards the 20th century, is leaving us in a sense in a state of suspension, much of the time in suspension, without necessarily an obvious or immediate resolution. Where this is going to lead to is at the end of our journey through the harmonic system, the need for resolution will disappear from music. We won't necessarily need a resolution for that sound. We can simply live in that suspension of that sound, in the tensions and the resolutions within that sound. So we are leaving the sense of surety of the 18th century, and now we are in the state of flux to some extent, seeing just a fragment of something, and in itself, it can be